Good afternoon, everybody. I grew up here in Decorah. It's a nice community. Lived here a long time. Graduated from high school. My folks are buried up in the cemetery up on the hill. My dad had a construction company. He has the office, or his warehouse was south of where the old outdoor theater was, a couple of blocks down there. So I've got a pretty good connection with the town. I wrote the book that I wrote because I'm disappointed with the understanding of our Constitution and our way of government. I mean, I hear so many people talk about a democracy, which is not what we have. We have a constitutional republic. And the difference would be like if you went down to vote and you had some referendums on your ballot. That would be a direct democracy because you're voting for a specific item. And if we had a direct democracy, we'd be going down to the polls virtually every day on every piece of legislation. And what happens over time in a democracy is people lose interest and special interest groups wind up running everything. And that's one of the reasons our founders didn't want that. And so what they gave us was a republic. Now, in a republic, we're allowed to elect people to make decisions for us. So your governor, your senators, your representatives, the president of the United States, you're electing these people to decide what is going to happen. So you go to the polls, you elect people that are going to represent you in government. That's far different from a direct democracy. There's a couple different feelings or views on the Constitution. When I was a kid, I was always taught that we had this living, breathing document. And over time, I kind of understood what they were talking about, and that is you're setting up the Supreme Court as kind of a super legislative body. And so they're making a decision up in the Supreme Court that may have nothing to do with what the Constitution says. And that's kind of bothered me. Sometimes they will make decisions based on what they think the populace wants. Sometimes it's just their own opinion. And with a Constitution that says what it says, I think that's the way to go. And that's why I believe in textualism and originalism. Textualism is simply reading the text. So if I were to open up the state statute books and start reading through a specific law that maybe we're going to court for or something, and I read that, I know the difference between may and shall. Shall is a must, so that something has to be done in that situation, where a may, you might have some leeway. Your judge can decide whether he's going to do this or do that. I mean, a good example lately anyway is the laws on drinking and driving, because they've tightened them up so much that there's really no leeway. If you're found guilty, that's what's going to happen. Okay, so they don't give you an opportunity. Now that's textualism. Okay, so you're actually believing what the text says. Originalism is a little different, because originalism means that you have to understand the historical perspective of why something was done the way it was. For instance, we have two branches of government or two branches of the legislatures. You have a Senate and you have a House of Representatives. And the purpose of having the two is the Senate is supposed to represent the states. And originally, before we had some amendments, the Senate was chosen by the state legislature. They were sent to represent the state. The House of Representatives was set up to represent the people. That's why it's commonly referred to as the people's house. And so as you go through the Constitution, everything is split up, everything's divided, and it was their purpose to limit power to any one person. For instance, as a House member, you can't belong to, say, you can't get a job, say, in Fish and Wildlife Department because they thought that you shouldn't be able to double dip and have two jobs. You shouldn't be able to, you know, you just get too much power. And they were very concerned about anybody having too much power. And I wrote this book primarily because of just the things that are out there being said. I mean, there's a guy who writes for the Los Angeles Times that's telling us we shouldn't have a Senate. That why should Wyoming have the same votes as we have here in California? That's not fair. Well, that's the whole point. You had two ideas of government, and the great compromise was we now have a branch that represents the states that's equal, and we have a branch that represents the population, which is a little unequal to the states. The states didn't want to be run over. And that's the same reason why we have an electoral college. So what I did was, between that's one fellow, and then I was listening to some talk radio hosts that were talking about nullification and saying that was legal. And I just don't see that anywhere in the Constitution. And I was trying to correct the record out there of the misconceptions between all the people that just haven't been taught and don't understand what we have. So I wrote up the Constitution in red, the exact language of it, paragraph by paragraph, and I've written down what it means through the lens of textualism and originalism, so that hopefully people would better understand our government. Now, a lot of people, the first thing they go to is they're worried about the amendments, because the amendments has your Bill of Rights. So, I mean, the First Amendment, we're talking about free speech, we're talking about assembly, we're talking about religion. And the whole purpose of having free speech in the first place is so that you have the right to complain to your government. You got a right to petition the government for change. You have a right to assemble so that you can show a mass number of people that want this change. And that's the whole purpose of it. That's why we can't have free speech zones and restricting speech here. That's why we can't have loads of censorship. I mean, the whole idea is that you can pretty much say whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt anybody. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, because you'll have people trampling and people will die. And you can't, and you can't have people slandering you. So if you're going to say things that are obviously untrue, like I saw that guy robbing the bank last week, and you've gone to court with that, obviously he has a right to sue you for slander because you've harmed him some way. But in a normal course of discourse, you should be able to talk and say whatever you want. It's the only way that we really get things settled. So then we have the freedom of religion, which is basically guaranteeing you the right to practice religion any way you want or any way you don't want. You have a right to go to your church, whatever church that happens to be. In England, they had a national church. And that's one of the reasons so many of our founders came here. You had the Pilgrims come here, you had Calvinists here, you had all kinds of different groups, you had Catholics here. Nobody wanted a state religion because they wanted everybody to be able to practice and serve God any way they chose to. And then we get to the Second Amendment, which is the right to keep and bear arms. Now, the first guarantee has it written as freedoms. The second is a right. And I would clearly argue that a right is different than a freedom. So, whereas you can be restricted in speech by yelling fire, you can't really be restricted from owning weapons. Okay, the whole purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect the country. That's why you have the first sentence, explaining why we need this right. And you have the second section telling you that it's the rights of people. A lot of people get confused that because they mention the militia, that it's the right for some National Guard unit to have weapons. But that's simply not the case. Our founders did not trust a standing army. A standing army, you don't know what they're going to do. You know, we had that issue in China a few years back with Tiananmen Square, where they had those pro-democracy movements, and eventually they got a crack unit to come in and just mow them down. And that's what we're in fear of here. That's why they wanted it separate. That's why they allowed militias. An army can only be funded for up to 2 years, according to the Constitution. A navy can be permanent, which is kind of an interesting side note there. But every 2 years, you have a new Congress who can reallocate funds for the Army. Then we get to the Third Amendment. And those soldiers can be quartered in your home. And this comes right out of the Constitution. I know a lot of people say today that could never happen here. But I believe it can. Hitler invaded Poland. And they seized homes, they seized businesses to run administration buildings. People had Nazis in their own home, basically spying on them, and that's the same thing we had here. When we were fighting for our revolution initially, you had a group come down from Canada, from their base up there, and there weren't enough places to house them, so they demanded that we house these soldiers. And so basically, they're spying on us. They blockaded our harbors. They're pretty much at war with us, and that's the whole purpose of that Third Amendment, is to protect us from having soldiers stationed in our homes, guarding over us, and deciding, you know, whether or not we have any rights at all. And there were cases where the soldiers were found guilty of, say, murder, or were charged with murder or something, and they had bogus courts set up to dismiss it. And so a lot of these things come right from our experiences with England during the course of the Revolution. Then we have the Fourth through Eighth Amendments, which, taken as a whole, protect us, the protection of the rights of the accused. Okay, we have a right to a speedy trial. We have a right to a defense. We have a right to call somebody in case of a defense, to allow to act on our own benefit. They can't force us to be a witness against ourselves. And all those things bring about the whole idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. Now in England, it was the opposite. You were guilty until proven innocent. And so they were trying to correct the problem they were having. When you get into the Ninth, we're talking about the enumeration clause. So if something isn't enumerated or numbered, which is what they mean by that, so the First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth Amendments, they're all numbered. Okay, but if something is not numbered, that does not necessarily mean that we don't have that right. Now, our founders believed in natural rights. You know, you got up this morning and you went and got dressed and you went over and got something to eat. You sat in your chair and you ate. Now, nobody said you had the right to do that, but that's a natural right to do that. Just as it's a natural right to walk down the street. And that's what they're referring to as some of these rights that they think. The other thing they were trying to do was be sure they didn't miss one of the rights when they wrote up the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was really opposed by the Federalists because they thought it was in throughout the Bill of Rights, that it was all spelled out and it didn't need to be numbered and added because it was already in there. But following the Constitutional Convention, there were a lot of people during the ratifying conventions throughout the states that thought well, gee, we're giving up these natural rights, but we don't have any guarantee against these other rights, so we want a Bill of Rights written up. So Madison took all these complaints and he wrote up a Bill of Rights. He had 19 items in the Bill of Rights. He had 19 amendments prepared. 17 of them made it through the House. The first thing he also had a preamble, and that was one of the first things that was dismissed. And once it got to the Senate, they reorganized it. They changed things. They didn't pass everything, and they came back with 12 amendments, and those were sent to the states. And of those 12, 10 were adopted. The first 2 were not. So the 3rd through the 12th is what the original 10 Bill of Rights are. The 2nd was passed, I believe, in '92, which made it so that if they gave themselves a raise, it wouldn't take effect until the next election of the legislature. So until the House of Representatives had an election, they wouldn't get their raise. That was the 2nd. The first the first one that was there that's still out there, that has not been approved, has to do with the number of representatives that we have in Congress. So if it were ever approved, we'd have a much larger Congress with about congressmen for every 40,000 people, is what that amendment that has not passed would do. The 10th Amendment is a nod to states' rights. It's simply saying that if it's not given to the federal government and it's not restricted to the states, then it belongs to the states and to the people. So if things aren't in the Constitution, it's not the federal government's business. For instance, traffic law. That's all done by states and by locality, which is why the federal government tried to blackmail the states when they wanted to lower our speed limit to 55 some years ago. Because they didn't have the right to do that because it wasn't their business. But they had money, and they were going to be determined that we obey. And so that's one of the things they tried to do. But the federal government, it's none of their business if it's not mentioned. Okay, the 11th is kind of interesting. The 11th Amendment comes from a lawsuit, Chisholm versus Georgia. Chisholm had sold ammunition, black powder, guns to Georgia during the Revolutionary War. Georgia didn't pay him. So he sued in federal court. The problem was he was a resident of South Carolina and not Georgia. So Georgia responded by not responding. They didn't send any defense. They wouldn't respond to any of the complaints from the court. So when they went up to the Supreme Court, had their ruling, they had never heard from Georgia. It was a 4-1 ruling against the states. So the 11th Amendment was written up and sent to the states then, which basically says a resident of one state cannot sue another state in federal court, and a foreigner cannot sue in federal court, cannot sue a state in federal court. So that's kind of a nutshell of that one. We get to the 13th through the 15th, we're dealing with slavery. We're dealing with the South. You know, we gave slavery, the children of slavery citizenship. We gave the slaves a right to vote. We made them equal citizens. We also made discrimination against them illegal. That also included our indentured servants. So you had slavery down south, but you have indentured servants up north, where they were basically a slave for a certain period of time. And all that was made illegal. The 16th has to do with income tax. It's pretty straightforward. The federal government has a right to to charge you an income tax. In the early days of the Republic, our taxes were mostly funded through tariffs, tariffs and duties. So this was really a large change. The whole idea was we needed money to pay for the Civil War. And that was the whole purpose of the income tax. And the 17th was a change that allowed for a direct election of your senators. So no longer were the states allowed to pick their senators. The people got a chance to pick their senators. But that does not mean the senators are not supposed to represent our states. Okay, the 18th and the 21st I put together because it's dealing with prohibition. We no longer have prohibition. It was a real disaster because you had mob violence. You had, mobsters shooting each other in Chicago. You had Al Capone and all these people. You had people making bathtub gin and going blind by it. But there was really a complete disrespect for law because nobody wanted to abide by not being able to have a drink. So it finally got repealed. The 19th gives women the right to vote. And pretty straightforward. The 20th has to do with the term. It used to be that our term ended at the end of March, a presidential term. So they changed that and they moved that to the 20th of January, and they fixed the dates for the House and Senate to begin. Then the 22nd really is a response to FDR. FDR was the big Democrat. He won 4 terms. The power of incumbency is such that it's very hard to take out an incumbent. So the fact that it was always tradition to be 2 terms, started by Washington, who didn't want to serve longer than a second term. And so we passed a term limit on the presidency. The 23rd has to do with the DC electors. So we are now allowing the District of Columbia to have electors for the purpose of electing a president. Prior to that, they either voted Virginia or Maryland. So it's not like they didn't have a vote. The founders were very worried about DC. It's a 10-mile area, and they were worried that legislators, senators, and your House members would come to the District of Columbia, they'd bring their wives, their children, they'd buy property there, and they would be in effect representing the District of Columbia and not the state they came from. And so when I hear calls for statehood, for DC, it bothers me because that's not what they wanted. And it's really fairly clearly spelled out, especially if you go and look through the debates of the Constitution itself. The 24th restricts a poll tax. So down south you had Jim Crow laws where they were trying to stop blacks from voting. So they would make you take a test and see if they thought you were smart enough or knowledgeable enough to vote. And obviously this is a big problem when you're restricting a segment of the population. Everybody should have a vote. So that changed that. The 25th has to do with the line of succession. They tightened that up so that it was obvious that the vice president would become president if the president died. The 26th gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. And then I mentioned the 27th earlier, which had to do with that it was part of the original 10th Amendments. The main documents cover an awful lot of area, from the We the People to the signature area. And we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. This isn't just flowery language, it means something. So we the people, in a world of 1787, was pretty radical. You had kings and queens, you had tyrants ruling all over the globe. So that really was a statement to the rest of the world that we're worried about we the people. And in order to form a more perfect union, what does that really mean? Well, they're talking about the fact that we are governed under the Articles of Confederation. They're trying to make a better government than what they had. In fact, originally the Constitutional Convention was called to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation. It wasn't meant to completely redo the Constitution. Madison spent a lot of time just studying prior to the Constitutional Convention every conceivable self-government plan he could find. And he came to the convention with an outline. And this outline became the Virginia Plan, which much of our Constitution is. Charles Pinckney from South Carolina also came with a plan. It's called the Pinckney Plan. Unfortunately, we don't have a full copy of the plan. It's been lost to history, but we do have notes from one of the other delegates explaining what's in there. And there were quite a few differences. For one thing, you had all the cabinet members for the president would be chosen by Congress. There were lots of situations like that. Originally, in our Constitution, the Electoral College did not specify whether which would be president and which would be vice president. So when the electors gathered, the top vote getter would be president and the second would be vice president. But when you got to the election of 1796, Adams was elected president and Thomas Jefferson lost by 2 electoral votes, so he became the vice president. And obviously that's a problem because you had a Federalist as president and you had the old Republican Party, which we refer to as the Grand Old Republican Party or the Jeffersonian Republicans. So you had him as the vice president. So obviously they weren't getting along. It was a problem. And so they changed that through the amendment process also. Marbury versus Madison was a Supreme Court case that came up in the waning days, early days of Jefferson. What happened was John Adams had appointed a bunch of judges after he lost election. Most of them were installed. But Marbury, he wasn't real ambitious about getting his appointment. And so he missed getting his appointment, and he tried to get Jefferson to give him his appointment, which he refused to do. So he refused to seat him. He couldn't get his documents to be seated. So he sued to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled with Marbury, but refused to force Jefferson to do it. And this is where we get judicial review from. So they basically took the power of judicial review to say where something was unconstitutional or not. So it becomes one of the most important decisions that we've ever had. Okay, then we get to the end of Adams' administration. Adams had passed this Alien and Sedition laws. And the Alien and Sedition laws, the alien part made it so instead of 5 years to become a citizen, it had to be 14 years. And the sedition laws, if you complained about his administration, he could have you arrested, thereby violating free speech. Okay, well, Jefferson didn't think much of that, and Madison didn't either. And they worked on the 1795 resolutions in secret because they would be found guilty of the sedition laws. And he got those passed through the state legislatures and was trying to claim that these laws are void because they violate the Constitution. And this is prior to Marbury's decision where the Supreme Court had judicial review, so they really had nowhere to go. Once Jefferson was elected, he allowed the one to pass, and he repealed. He got the other repealed because by then the Republicans had control of both branches. So that's how it finally got settled. But today I hear discussion about we're going to nullify this. It's just nullification. You have secession going on, especially, the greater Idaho deal. You have a city down in part of Atlanta that wants to secede from Atlanta. You've got state compacts where states are trying to get around the Electoral College. So they want to go by popular vote, but that's illegal according to the Constitution. No state can have a compact with another state or with another country, because that's something that belongs to the federal government. The Constitution really matters. When I was beginning to write this book, I had people tell me, well, nobody cares about the Constitution. Well, I get a little tired of that. Every president, vice president, assemblyman, congressman, senator, the state regardless, right down to the cop, your local cop has to make an oath that he will stand up for the Constitution, usually of the federal government and of the state where you reside. And so I really do think it's really important that we understand the Constitution. That's really what I was trying to get to, is because the schools aren't teaching it. We have voters that don't know it. We have elected officials that don't care. You've got everybody squirming around trying to find a way for more power. It isn't about power, and it's not about party. This isn't just for Democrats. It's not for Republicans. It's not for the Farm and Labor Party. It's for all of us. And we really should take heed of how important it really is. And the liberty our founders gave us was so important. We have people that just don't understand it. They haven't lived under tyranny. They don't understand what's going to happen. And when the schools don't push it, they don't teach civics, what have we got? We got a mess. And I just really want everybody to understand that. I'll take any questions if everyone has anything. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, here in Iowa, even township trustees take an oath to uphold the U.S. and the Iowa Constitution. That's one of the things we have to do. So it's down even past the sheriff's level here in Iowa. Second of all, could you please explain the textualism and originalism of the term promote the general welfare? Because I think that's has been really abused throughout the ages. It's not what the original founders wanted.
No.
Could you please explain that?
Well, the general welfare just basically means we can all live amongst each other in peace without having to worry about it, it's for the betterment of all of us. It doesn't mean that it's some grand welfare state. It doesn't mean that you have a right to even education as far as that goes. It doesn't mean you have a right to, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things that people just seem to think they have a right to. They have a right not to starve. They have a right to virtually everything they think, and it's just not so. Now you have the federal Constitution, and then you've got states under that. So some things that aren't in the federal Constitution fall to the state level. Now I know the Constitution, the state Constitution in my state anyway, does give you a right to self-defense. The federal government doesn't give you the right to self-defense unless we're going to natural rights under the 9th. So the Second Amendment is a guarantee to protect the country. It's not for personal protection. But I know, like, my state does have it in there, and I think a grand majority of them do. But then you've also got regular laws that are passed, that your legislatures pass. So you have a number of rights out there. And as far as what you're talking about, people just assume that general welfare means this grand welfare state, and it's not what they meant by it. They weren't interested in some social experiment, unless you're talking about the social experiment of representative government. Does anybody else have anything?
But if you're a felon, like you couldn't vote before, was that a federal thing or was that a state thing? Like if you commit a felony, you can't vote, and then people bitch, hey, I'm gonna vote. Is that
I'm
federal or
not
state?
sure. It's not in the Constitution. I think it's a legislative acts, and I think that is probably in state law.
I was just wondering, if you're a felon, like who would you go to and say, hey, I'm gonna vote?
Well, I
And
think
who's stopping you?
what you would have to do is you'd have to get your legislature to change the law to allow you to vote.
You could say you lived in Florida, and Florida had a rule that felons can't vote.
And they do.
So you just go to Georgia and you say, well, I'll vote there. As far as like a national,
Well,
like for president,
right.
not for governor.
It's possible if you were to move to another state, every state has different laws. If you don't like the laws in your state, you can pick up and move to another state that's more amicable to what you would
I
like.
was just wondering if that was a federal or state law. Like you could get a post office box, wouldn't you? And you say, well, I'm gonna vote out of that.
I think it's state laws, but
Okay.
but I could be wrong, but I believe certain states are allowing it and others aren't.
I just wondered if that was how you do with the Constitution.
Well, I know that I had gotten an OWI as a second offense years ago. I got 2 years of probation, so at that time I could not vote. It was not a felony, it was just an aggravated misdemeanor.
Okay.
Once I was released successfully, did everything they asked me to do, got rid of my probation, got off paper. We got a letter from then Governor Branstad reinstated I had to fill out a form, mail it back to him to reinstate my rights to vote in things.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, and so I think in, like what Laurel's asking, I would think, depending on what state, I suppose, is probably appeal to your governor. You know, he may be able to reinstate your rights, considering maybe what your specific crime was.
Yeah.
How serious of an offense it was.
Well, a governor does have the right to, what word am I looking for? As the right to give grievance anyway. That's not the correct word. I'm at a loss.
Pardon.
Yeah, he has a right to pardon you. The president has a right to pardon you if it's a federal offense, not if it's a state offense. But your legislature, I would bet, passed a law that allowed you to get your rights back after you had served your time, and whatever offense that is. So I would think that's probably, and then he probably sent you the letter explaining that you're going to have your rights back, and honestly, you should. If you've done your time, you should be allowed to come back and be a respectable member of the society again. I mean, there's no reason to punish somebody forever.
That was heavily debated in the legislature quite recently, and the sticking point is, yeah, I mean, if you have served your times, you ought to get that back. But what if you have not paid your restitution? That was the sticking point.
That's a sticking
Yeah,
point.
that is a sticking point.
Well, I don't know, my opinion is until you have satisfied what the court has ordered and everything that's been set out for you, until you've completely satisfied that, you don't get your rights back. You have to follow through it.
No, that's probably the way it should be, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure that's the way it is.
Okay, well,
How about, is it the 15th Amendment that gives birthright citizenship?
yeah, I don't agree with that.
How do you read that?
Well,
I didn't ask whether you liked it or not, I asked how you read that.
let's look it up.
Okay,
15 or 14?
I'm not sure, one or the other.
I believe it's 14.
Okay.
Maybe it's 15.
I know it's right in there, but I'm not sure.
It's not either. I'll just say.
What was the 15th
It's
Amendment?
13.
The 15th is in case of removal of president. The 14, the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for a senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state.
How about the
13th.
13th
13th
Amendment, the 13th. Right in there, one of those Civil War ones, 13th, 14th.
Has to do with DC electors. Well, I don't know where it is offhand, but I know it's in there. But I'll tell you why I see it. It says that if anyone was born in here, it's basically for slavery. So the children of slaves would get it, and it talks about if they are subject to your laws. Okay, I would argue that being you're subject to if you're subject to the laws, that doesn't necessarily mean you were born here. Okay, so if you came from France, you're actually a subject of that king or whatever, and you are not subject to our laws. So I think.
Well, no, wait a second. You can come from France all you want. When you are here, you are subject to our laws.
Well, I don't know if that's really so or not.
Try speeding and give them a French driver's license, see if they can.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but you're still a citizen of the other country, so you aren't our subject. You're theirs, unless you come here to stay, and you're.
Now, if you're a diplomat or something like that.
Well, then you have diplomatic immunity.
That's right. So you're not subject to our laws. So there's somebody that wouldn't be a citizen if they were born of a diplomat.
Yeah, well, I can't say exactly what I said here, but that's what I believe. I believe, Trump came up with this thing just before the last election and was saying this, and I thought he was crazy. But when I went through it and I looked at it and I looked at the exact language of it, and with the idea that was not their intention to give anybody that just happened to cross the border citizenship because they were pregnant and walked across the border and gave birth, I don't think that was the intention of the amendment.
It looks to me like that's the way it's written.
Well, here, the exact wording is, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to jurisdiction thereof. So someone from France who is still a French citizen is not born or naturalized here in the United States.
The child of that person is certainly subject to the laws and was born here. So then it looks to me like they'd be a citizen.
Well, I fail to differ. Because I really think that they are still subject to the laws of the country of which they're a citizen of. My wife is a Russian citizen.
So if this person that comes from France comes over here, and as you view, the French are going to probably prosecute me?
Well, I think we probably, honestly, the way things have been working lately, we probably just deport you.
But I think I'd be subject to the laws here, no matter where I was born, if I shot somebody here.
Okay, well, I think we differ.
Okay, what if the girl comes across the border, has her baby here, it's not a citizen?
Well, it is based on what they're doing today, but I don't think constitutionally they are.
What if the father was an American? The father of the baby is an American, the mother is Mexican, she comes over across the border and has a baby over here. Still not a citizen?
I think in that case probably is.
Well, I mean,
Because you'd have citizenship through the father.
what if they weren't married, but?
Well,
it's still
the other
father.
thing you have is you could have two people on vacation over here and have a baby. That doesn't necessarily mean they should become a citizen.
I mean, somebody was an American citizen though. The father was, not the mother.
Well, I still would say that
I'm just
that
saying,
baby's a
what's
citizen.
interpretation of the law.
But the idea under originalism is we're talking about original intent. and original intent was to give black children of the black slaves citizenship. It wasn't meant for any other purpose. And so I have to go back to I go back to original intent and what the idea was at the time of the passage of that amendment. And so I would still say that they are not citizens if they are citizens of another country. Yeah, go ahead.
17th Amendment. We have a legislative priority in the Iowa Republican State Platform to repeal the 17th Amendment. Basic, can you just explain a little bit more? Because what it looks like to me is that the 17th Amendment basically creates another House of the People. Because the 17th Amendment allows direct elections of senators by the people, which is the same thing as the House is intended to do. And the whole purpose of having the senators elected by the legislators is that the people had more direct contact with the legislators that were electing the senators, and the senators were not obligated to the people, they were obligated to the state. And making them simply directly elected by the people just created another House of Representatives that's elected for 6 years instead of for 2 years.
Yeah, I see where you're going there. And I don't really know what I could say because the amendment clearly allowed them clearly allowed a direct election. I'm not sure how to, the only way that could be repealed would be through another amendment striking the first, kind of like what we did with prohibition.
I'll throw out another one. Term limits. What do you believe the founders would think of term limits for senators and House of Representatives?
Well, I think if they were here today, they'd want them because they had enough problem with people having too much power. That's why they divided it up into 3 branches. That's why you have 2 different legislative branches in the legislature. I mean, that's why, you know, the president can sign off on a treaty, but the Senate has to approve it. That's why he gets to pick nominees, and the Senate has to approve it. That's why all spending bills has to start at the House and not at the Senate.
But then here again, the way to fix it is another constitutional amendment that changes.
That's right, you can do that, they can do that. If we get that, I'm not disputing that it shouldn't be. I'm simply saying that it isn't right now, and that would be the only way to do it. And he asked what the founders would think, and I truly believe that they would be appalled.
Which doesn't mean a thing.
Well, I don't think the founders anticipated, it wasn't a paid position then. You were elected, you went and served, you served, and then you went back to doing your normal job.
It was paid.
Not like it is nowadays.
No,
And,
but
I mean,
but you did receive
very
pay.
lucrative. I mean, it's very lucrative now. I mean, Congress made it lucrative where it could be a career. And I don't think our founding fathers intended it to be anybody's career.
Well, they certainly did not.
Yeah.
I mean,
They
Washington.
even foresaw that happening. That's probably the only thing they missed.
Well, Washington, for instance, you know, he fought the war. The war ended. He said goodbye to his troops. He turned in his commission to Congress, and he went home. He didn't intend to serve anymore.
Yeah, well, they tried to make him like a king, and he said, "No, I'm done too with that."
And then
I mean, he was a great man in that aspect.
As far as the term limits go, what does that mean in a row? Like you could be president
Well-
2 terms, take time off, then come back and be president again?
No,
You couldn't.
no. There's a limit to only 2 terms. You can only be elected twice.
That's what I
That's
was
a
wondering.
constitutional amendment.
Right, but when you talk about term limits for the rest, I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do. For instance, you could allow 3 terms as House, you could allow a couple as Senator, you could scatter it out so you could have a career in government.
That's what I can say. I'm the senator of Iowa.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be the senator of Illinois now.
Yeah.
I'll be the senator.
The picnic plan actually allowed you to serve 1 term, and then you had to step down and not serve for a period of time, and then you could come back and serve again. So that's just one of the interesting things that they were discussing in the convention.
So there was somebody there that recognized the power of the incumbency.
Well, okay, yeah, I suppose so. And then you also had the New Jersey plan later. They tried to replace the Virginia plan with the New Jersey plan at one time. But eventually, you know, they had the great compromise where, you know, you had two different types of legislatures, so they just put them both. And I really think it served us well. Go
I have another one. Big controversy now with term limits is a constitutional convention. You know, you have the one side that says it's in the Constitution, it's what our founders wanted, and you have the other side that says it's just going to be something that runs away, and they'll get rid of the whole Constitution, and that's a way for, you know, communists to push their agenda on
Great
us.
big can of worms.
What's your opinion of it, or how do you see it?
Well, let's first talk about the Federalist Papers, because I can't remember which one. I don't know if it's 10 or what number it is. But Madison was actually arguing against that, because that's one of the things the other people in the state legislatures wanted. They wanted to start all over. You know, they weren't happy with the document, some of them weren't, and they wanted to start all over. And he said that would be a big disaster. You know, the thing is, you get into a new constitutional convention, you get a new state meeting, they can do whatever they want as representatives. They could strike anything in the Constitution they wanted. And I think that's the big worry I would have on it, because you don't know what's going to come out of there. You'd still would have to, because it would be amendable, you'd still have to get it through all the state legislatures, which would probably be pretty tough. But I don't know. I certainly understand the concerns of people in the states that think they're being overridden, think they don't have any representation because they're either in a state that's way too red or way too blue. And they're concerned about their rights. And I certainly understand that. But one of the reasons that's even there, that's there and the amendments there, is because the founders wanted a perpetual document. This whole argument that the founders never intended for this to be going on for over 200 years is just a little ridiculous when you understand that this argument of having a perpetual constitution. And that's the reason it was left open. But I guess that's the best I can answer on that point. Anyone else?
Second Amendment, right to bear arms. What's all considered an arm? Does it have to be a gun with powder? Could it be like an air pistol?
Well,
Powder,
I think when we're looking,
slingshot?
I think when we're looking at the document and we're looking at when it was passed, we're talking about cannons. We're talking about guns. So you are talking about firearms. You're talking about knives. Now, they always want to point out this arms race, and they say that they never thought of, you know, multi, you know, bullet weapons and all this stuff, but it's there for the protection and security. It's there for the security of a free state, and the only way to have a security of a state is to keep up with the military grade weapons. Now that was a military grade, a single shot with black powder was a military grade weapon in 1792 when the Bill of Rights was finally ratified. So I would say yes, we're definitely talking about firearms. I don't know what else you could be talking about. Now, you can kill somebody with anything. You could take a butcher knife. I mean, you
Car.
can. Yeah. Well, you could take a heavy object in the house and hit somebody over the head with it. I mean, it's not going to if we were to get rid of the Second Amendment, we aren't going to get rid of murder. It's going to go on. We just had, where was that? Up in Idaho? We just had four kids murdered with a knife in their sleep, apparently. I mean, there's just, at some point we have to be reliable. We have to be taking care of our own and you have to be responsible, and teaching kids that everything is okay is just a recipe for disaster going forward. If there's not a point where you say no, then everything becomes okay. And I think that's what we're at a lack of morality. It's not that guns are the problem, it's that we have no morality anymore. And I think that's really what we're faced with.
Yeah, and the gun laws we have now are not terribly strictly enforced. I see felons picked up with a firearm, they get 2-3 years and they'll be out in about 1.5 years. The law says they could be sentenced up to 10 years. Maybe the law should say 25 to 50.
Or maybe the law should say must and not
Yeah,
may.
it's just shall and not may.
Yeah, maybe that law needs to be tightened up to say something just like they did with the drunk driving laws. Instead of maybe, it should be shall. He shall be sent to prison for 10 years or some such thing. You know, there's a lot of leeway. And then the other point is, when you're in court and you've been sentenced for something, you know, there is an argument for allowing the judge to have some leeway of making a decision on that specific case. So I mean, I don't know what to say. I certainly would. I don't want us to be letting people out that are going to kill and hurt somebody else, or rape somebody, or do armed robbery, or any of these things. Obviously, we need a safe community to live in, and really that's what it all comes down to. Is these rules, this Constitution, it's a way of designing a system where we can all live in relative peace and safety. And we can still do what we want to do for the most part without running afoul to the government.
I don't know. You're talking about freedom of speech and libel laws. A lot of people nowadays say that for politicians, for someone to be considered liable for saying something about a politician, that the bar is way too high for public officials. I think a lot of people don't understand, like the election of 1800, what they were saying about each other back then. Do you believe that that's true, that the bar for libel for an elected public official is too high, it should be lower? Or do we need that differentiation between a public official and a private individual?
I think everybody should be treated the same. That's what I think. If you take a position as a public official, part of the deal is that there are certain things you just can't say or do. You know, because you have to face an electorate again.
Unless you're on the floor of the Senate or the House, then you can say anything you want to.
Yeah, while you're in that room.
Yeah. Well, that's true enough. I certainly don't want to restrict my senator from arguing a point on a piece of legislation. But that's a far different thing than saying John Barry raped 3 girls and was caught with a gun chasing a black guy down the street, and you know, that's a whole different thing. So if you get specific and you're pointing to a specific person, then you're in charge for libel. If you're talking generally, I don't see a problem with that. You know, the free speech wasn't meant to say what everybody wants to hear. So, I mean, that's why they let the Nazis march through Skokie some years ago. You know, you got a right to protest. You got a right to do these things, even for things that repulse you. I'll tell you what, I remember the Nazis coming to the state capitol, the state I live in, and they had a permit to speak for 2 hours. They were the National Socialists, which is the Nazi party. They came down there from Minnesota. I believe it was the capital of Minnesota or somewhere around the Twin City area. So they came down, they spoke their 2 hours, they had their bullhorns, they spoke their garbage, and as soon as their 2 hours was up, they packed up and left. And nobody bothered them. But the whole, you know, you've got to allow things to be discussed, even if you don't like them, because it's the only way to resolve things. Because if that group isn't allowed to speak, then maybe you aren't allowed to speak. And maybe this guy over here can't say what he wants. Well, we should be able to allow it to speak as long as we aren't hurting anybody. Now, the libel laws, yeah, you can't destroy somebody in speech. You shouldn't be able to. You shouldn't be able to personally attack people. And I think the politicians, with their ability to speak the way they speak, and to just wrap a worm around their finger somehow, I think they can find a way to speak without libeling somebody. That's what I would think. I think the laws are for everyone. And granted, if you're a House member and you've committed a crime, you might be able to hide for a certain time. But the Constitution says you are immune from prosecution for the time that you are on in Congress, and for the time you're traveling to and from, or for a speaking engagement. But it does not give you the right to be immune forever. So as soon as you aren't in a situation where you're immediately representing your people, you can be arrested. And we have to be fair to everybody, but we also have to hold our representatives, honestly, to a higher bar than us, because they're supposedly the better. They've gone up, we've sent people up there, we've elected people, and they should abide by the same laws as everyone else. That includes your cops and everybody else. They know the law, they should be abiding by it.
Including the laws that cover stock trading and insider trading.
Yes, sir, I agree with that. The problem we have with those laws, honestly, is the Congress is constantly letting themselves off the hook. They'll pass a law for everybody else, and they'll make themselves immune from that law. And if they're going to pass a law on us, they should be made to pass that same law on themselves.
In a related note, let's say a public servant fulfills their service that leads to the release of a criminal that kills a large number of people, let's say in a Christmas parade. Is there any way that public servant can be prosecuted for that?
I don't really know.
I think that would be a great question.
I think it would be a great law.
It would be a great law.
You do. But then you run into situations where parole boards, would they let anybody out?
Yeah, nobody ever get out. I can't let anybody out. If you do anything wrong, I'll have to pay
Right
for it.
now, we got governors and presidents that seem to want to let everybody out.
Well, the thing is you can pick who's dangerous and who's not. That would be a good line.
Yeah, that's true enough. I don't agree with letting people off. If they've done a crime, they need to do whatever. They need to have some there has to be some semblance of justice, and justice has to be equal. We can't have justice for one group and not justice for the other.
How does it work? Say the girl's gonna go down to the abortion clinic and have an abortion. She's about 10 feet from the door, and I'm riding down my bicycle on the sidewalk and I hit her and she loses the baby. Am I liable for that baby's death?
You might be.
She was going to the abortion clinic anyways.
What?
She was just gonna have it.
You say she.
See, I'm
You
just
say
saying.
she's going to the
Well,
abortion
she has a
clinic,
point.
and she might have changed her mind, as he said.
You know, I'm just saying.
But I know of cases where somebody hit a pregnant woman and they're charged with murder.
Double murders. Sometimes the woman dies
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, I know of cases where those things have happened.
Your bicycle was on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Something. I'm just saying, like, I can't be charged with that. You killing anyways. I don't know. How's that happen? How's that work?
I don't know. You can all.
What's going on, fellas?
It depends how the argument.
For having
is.
a,
You know, I'm-
you're getting, you know,
maybe you're in the building, you bumped into her, she fell down the steps. She's like, oh, now, lost a baby.
Well, I guess when you're in that situation and you're in a court of law, it depends on what happens during the trial.
But I thought,
I mean, it's hard to say about something when you don't know what's gonna come out in trial.
but how can you charge it to death? It's legally, that baby isn't even born, it's not a human being.
Well, that has kind of bothered
You know,
me
kind of-
because I don't know which way to play it. They wanna say that it's not a baby, and yet they're charging you with murder of a baby, so I don't know how,
can't write out
the
your
two
taxes, can you?
justify each other.
If you're like doing your taxes and say, 5 months right here, I got one more kid.
Yeah, but you can't do that, it hasn't been born yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
I'm
can't,
just saying,
you
know,
can't use a baby in the belly as a tax write-off.
Well, then I like it. Anybody can be charged with this. Death, I don't know.
Well, it can happen, I don't know what to tell you.
Then you get a good lawyer.
There's a big push now to make quote hate speech illegal. I assume the founders they would be completely against anything being termed hate speech.
Well, look, if you're in the act of killing somebody and you start screaming some derogatory terms toward them, how does that make it any worse than the murder? I mean, I don't understand. You're killing somebody ostensibly because you hate them. You hate them enough that you're going to kill them. So how does saying something in the crime make it some kind of, what makes it different? It's already illegal to kill the person. I just don't understand that.
This applies same toward that they want to push hate crimes. As far as I'm concerned, you don't assault somebody because you love them.
Right.
So I have a real problem with anything being termed a hate
Yeah,
crime.
well, I don't like those because I think you have a right to hate anybody you want. I mean, you know, I don't have to like everybody. I have to be decent to everybody. I have to be kind to people, but it doesn't mean I have to like them. I mean, not everybody likes me. You know, I mean, it just comes down to that. You should, you know, but you should have some kind of free speech. If I want to talk, I mean, like we was just talking about the National Socialists. Well, you can bet they were spewing a lot of hate speech there, but there was no crime. You know, so until you have an actual crime, how can you punish somebody for thought?
What if I had a hate speech saying like I hated boxing? And Decorah was gonna have a big boxing match in Decorah. And I write some big thing in the paper, I hate it because it causes brain injuries. And Decorah just lost all that revenue because I made a big stink, I hated boxing. Is that hate crime?
I would think so.
I don't know.
You're espousing your opinion that you don't like the boxing, and if you don't like the boxing, well, so what?
But when the boxing, you just hate boxing, that's why I wasn't able to do that video. I lost, days paid because your hate towards me caused their job.
Sex and race.
Wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I just
I'm
don't.
just saying, we
I
lost
don't-
that event.
Well, that comes down to free speech, though. You've got a right
So it's
to.
hate crime
How is it a crime?
because he hated that.
But there's no crime. So all you did was give a free speech. All you did was use your free speech to argue something that you were opposed to. Now there's no crime in that.
And somebody could say their life was ruined because they blew that event. They had bodyguards and everything. It costed them $10,000 because I shot my mouth off. They weren't able to have their fight here.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm just, I'm
I
saying,
really
I'm
have
not
to-
saying anyway physically.
I don't know. I mean, that's one for a judge to decide. I don't know.
So sue. You can sue anybody.
Yeah,
If you win or not is another question.
that is a fact. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.